They say grief is love with nowhere to go. But what if love, even after death, still knows its way home? Welcome to Vale Marks, where every story is a whisper from the heart. Today's tale is not just about a dog or a woman. It's about memory, loss, and the invisible threads that tie souls together across time. As you watch, I invite you to stay until the very end, because somewhere between the raindrops and silence, there's a message waiting just for you. This story carries more than tears. It carries truth. And truth, like love, always finds its way back. Helen Foster had long stopped expecting surprises. At 64, her world had shrunk to the quiet creaks of the old house she lived in and the soft whisper of her slippers against the wooden floor. Her cottage stood on the edge of a sleepy neighborhood just outside town, where the leaves turned gold a little earlier and the wind carried stories no one was left to hear. It had been 3 years since the accident. 3 years since the sun had stopped shining the same way through the kitchen window. 3 years since her daughter, Lily, then only 12, had waved goodbye for the last time and never come back. Since then, Helen's life had fallen into a pattern so precise it could have been printed on a clock. She would wake just after dawn, not because she wanted to, but because her body had forgotten how to sleep in. She'd shuffle into the kitchen, boil water for tea, and pour it into the same floral cup Lily had given her one Mother's Day. Then she'd sit in her armchair by the window and stare at the framed photo of Lily on the side table, her little girl with a gap-toothed grin, wearing that sky-blue dress she insisted on wearing even in winter. Helen never touched that room upstairs, Lily's room. Dust had settled on every surface like snow in a forgotten world. The books on the shelf still leaned where Lily had left them. A tiny hairbrush still sat on the dresser. Even the bedspread remained slightly creased, the last imprint of a girl who once filled the house with laughter and the scent of strawberry shampoo. Helen passed by that door every morning, her hand always hovering at the doorknob, never quite turning it. She had no pets, never had the heart for them, and friends, once steady and nearby, had slowly faded, unsure of what to say, what to do in the presence of someone who had lost their entire universe. Neighbors came and went, their lives a blur of mailboxes and lawnmowers. The only thing that stayed was the quiet, and Helen, alone in it. That morning, the sky wore its autumn colors proudly, soft orange and pale blue, with clouds like torn lace drifting across. The ground was damp with dew, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees as Helen opened the front door to fetch the paper. She wasn't expecting anything unusual, perhaps a squirrel darting across the lawn or the familiar creak of the mailbox. But instead, there it was. Sitting right in the center of her welcome mat was a small, battered teddy bear. Its fur was faded, one ear nearly torn off, and the stitching along its belly had come loose. It wasn't new. It wasn't clean. But Helen knew it instantly. She froze. That teddy bear wasn't just familiar. It was Lily's. Not just any toy, but the one Lily had clutched every single night since she was a toddler. "Mr. Snuggles," she had called him, with the kind of deep affection children give to things that protect them from the monsters in the dark. Even after Lily had grown older and insisted she didn't need him anymore, she still kept Mr. Snuggles on her bed. It was the one toy Helen had never been able to find after the accident. She assumed it had been lost, left somewhere in the chaos of that day. But now, somehow, impossibly, it was here, on her porch, looking exactly as it had in her memory. Helen's hands trembled as she bent down to pick it up. Her fingers brushed the familiar threads, the worn patch on its paw. It was real. She turned it over, finding the little red heart she had stitched on years ago when the bear had split open during a move. A wave of memories surged, too fast, too sharp. She was back in Lily's room, tucking the bear in beside her daughter, brushing her hair away from her face. She was back in the garden, watching Lily carry the bear like a baby. She was back on that horrible afternoon, calling Lily's name over and over, not understanding why the world had suddenly gone silent. Helen sank onto the porch step, clutching the bear to her chest. Tears streamed down her face before she even knew she was crying. It was too much. The sudden reappearance, the impossibility of it, the ache that had never truly left her. She looked around, scanning the yard. No one was there, no cars passing, no kids playing, just the breeze and the soft rustle of leaves. Who could have left it? And more importantly, how? She brought the bear inside, placed it carefully on Lily's bed. For the first time, she opened the door again. The room smelled musty, but untouched. Light poured in through the blinds, landing gently on the sheets. She set Mr. Snuggles right where he belonged, as if he'd never been gone. That day, Helen didn't make tea. She sat in Lily's room, staring at the bear, trying to piece together what had happened. Maybe someone found it near the old school and returned it by chance. Maybe a kind neighbor recognized it. But those explanations felt thin, like paper trying to hold the weight of grief. Somewhere deep inside, she felt it. That flicker. Not of fear, not of confusion, but something else entirely. Wonder. The kind of wonder that only visits when the universe shifts, just slightly, to whisper, "You're not alone." She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The teddy bear was only the beginning. The very next morning, Helen opened her front door half expecting nothing, hoping the strange, impossible event had been a one-time anomaly, a final echo of the past. But there it was again, something new, something old. This time it was a doll, a small plastic figure with tangled blonde hair and a missing glass eye, one leg bent at an odd angle, its dress frayed at the edges. Helen's breath caught the moment she saw it. The chill in the early autumn air was nothing compared to the sudden freeze in her chest. It wasn't just any doll, it was the doll, Lily's favorite for years. Helen still remembered the tantrum her daughter had thrown in the store when she saw it for the first time, clutching it tight and refusing to leave without it. They'd named her Ellie, and Lily had treated her like a real friend, brushing her hair, tucking her into bed, even saving her a seat at the dinner table when she was 5. And now here Ellie was, sitting neatly on the doormat as though she'd simply walked back home. Helen brought the doll inside, her hands trembling. The moment she touched the plastic skin, the scent of childhood filled her mind. Peanut butter sandwiches, freshly laundered sheets, the shampoo Lily had used. Her knees felt weak again, and she sat down at the edge of the couch, cradling the doll like something fragile and holy. She didn't sleep that night. The morning after, it was a toy car. Red, rusted, with one wheel bent and a faded lightning bolt painted along its side. She found it lying just beneath the porch light. Helen picked it up slowly, as if expecting it to vanish. She turned it over, her fingers brushing the sticker still half attached on the bottom. Her eyes filled again. She remembered this one, too. Lily had called it Speedy, and it had once raced across every kitchen tile and coffee table in the house. One Christmas, Lily had even painted tiny white stripes on it with nail polish because she said it looked more like a race car that way. The stripes were still there, faint, cracked, but unmistakably Lily. 3 mornings, 3 memories. By the end of the week, the gifts had become routine, hauntingly, heartbreakingly routine. A faded jump rope with one cracked handle, a tiny teacup from Lily's old plastic tea set, its pink paint chipped. And then, the one that broke Helen completely, a children's book. The Rainy Night Bear, the spine barely holding together, the cover wrinkled and soft with age. The pages still smelled faintly of crayons and lavender, a scent that only existed in memory. Helen opened it to the first page, where Lily had once scribbled her name in oversized, looping letters. She broke down right there on the porch. That book had been their comfort during storms. Every time the wind howled or the thunder cracked, Helen and Lily would crawl into bed together, flashlight in hand, and read about the little bear who found warmth in the coldest rain. Helen would read while Lily clutched her tight, face buried in her shoulder. That story had helped them both through more than one long, sleepless night. Now, the book was back, and Helen didn't know how. She tried to tell herself it was a coincidence. Maybe someone was leaving these things for donation and got the address wrong. Maybe some child was playing a game. Maybe it was just a weird, cruel twist of fate. But the truth was undeniable. These weren't random objects. They were Lily's, every single one. Helen knew them like she knew her own hands, and someone, or something, was returning them one by one, as if they were part of a puzzle she was meant to solve. But who could it be? Helen didn't have family left, no close friends, no one who'd know enough to find these things, let alone know what they meant. Some of the items had been missing for years, not even things Helen remembered keeping. Had they been left behind in a move? Had someone found them? Or had they never truly been lost? Was someone watching her? Someone who knew Lily? Fear and curiosity twisted together inside her. Part of her wanted to slam the door and never open it again. But a deeper part, a quieter, older part, wanted answers, needed them. That night, Helen made a decision. She dug out the old security camera she had bought years ago but never installed. With trembling fingers and a ladder that groaned beneath her weight, she fixed it above the front door. It wasn't fancy. It only recorded when there was motion, but it would be enough. As she stood back and looked at the blinking red light, a strange mix of emotions settled over her. Hope, dread, wonder. She didn't know what she expected to see. A neighborhood kid playing a prank? An old friend trying to comfort her anonymously? A ghost? She sat by the window all night, the teddy bear on her lap, the doll beside her on the couch. The house, once a tomb of silence, now felt alive with mystery. Something was happening, something bigger than her grief, something that crackled in the air like static before a storm. For the first time in years, Helen didn't feel entirely alone. There was something, or someone, reaching out to her, through objects, through memory, through love that refused to be forgotten. She didn't yet understand why. But deep inside, where her mother's heart still beat beneath layers of sorrow, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The next morning, Helen didn't even bother making tea. She sat by the window, eyes fixed on the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and the camera footage from the night before loaded on her tablet. She had barely slept, her mind tangled in a web of questions too strange to ignore. Her hands trembled as she tapped the screen, forwarding through hours of stillness until, there, motion. It was nearly 4:13 a.m., the world still swallowed in sleep. The grainy footage showed a shadow approaching from the edge of the frame. Helen leaned closer, her breath caught in her throat. At first it was hard to make out, but as the figure drew near, the shape became unmistakable. A dog. Not a small one either. A broad-chested, strong-legged Pitbull with a short, rough coat in a dusty brown-gray color. Its body moved unevenly, a noticeable limp in its left hind leg. Even through the limited clarity of the night vision camera, there was something hauntingly graceful about it. Like it wasn't sneaking, but honoring something sacred. In its mouth, it carried something. The dog stepped silently onto the porch, paused at the welcome mat, and gently laid the object down. Then it stood for a moment, still, almost reverent, before turning and disappearing back into the shadows from where it came. Helen stared at the screen in stunned silence. A dog. A dog had been delivering Lily's toys. She replayed the footage again and again, each time trying to catch some missed clue, some tag, collar, or glimmer of ownership. But the animal wore nothing, no leash, no sign of being claimed, just the limp, the calmness, and the gift. How, she thought, pressing the bear on her lap tighter. How would a dog find these things? How would it know to bring them to her? Helen had lived in this neighborhood for almost 20 years. She'd seen her fair share of strays, but none quite like this. A pit bull that moved like it had known sorrow, that carried toys like memories, and above all, one that appeared without warning under the veil of night. The next morning, there was no new toy on the porch. Helen stepped outside anyway, half hopeful, half disappointed. The air was cooler than usual, the breeze tugging gently at her robe. She glanced down the street, then up at the trees swaying above. Silence. She looked back at the doormat. Nothing. But then she noticed something new, not on the mat, but beside it. A paw print, deep, pressed into the soft soil just next to the step. Large and muddy, the imprint of a heavy animal, and near it, smaller prints leading back toward the sidewalk. Her eyes followed the trail as far as it would go. Helen walked back inside with her mind spinning. She placed a bowl of water by the front door. Then, after rummaging through the pantry, she found an old can of chicken stew, poured it into a small dish, and set it beside the water. A peace offering. A thank you. A silent invitation. She sat by the window again that night, light off, eyes wide. And the next morning, just as she had hoped, the dish was empty, the water half drunk, and on the welcome mat, another toy. This one, a faded blue block from an old alphabet set. The letter L still faintly visible. Helen felt her knees weaken again. She dropped to the porch step, holding the block tightly, pressing it to her lips. Lily had loved that toy when she was just a toddler. She used to carry the whole set around in a tiny basket, proudly reciting each letter like she was giving a performance. And this dog, this limping, silent visitor, had brought it back. Over the next few mornings, Helen started waking up earlier. She found herself listening in the dark, ears straining for the sound of soft paws on wood. Though she never managed to catch the dog in person, she always found the signs: an empty bowl, a paw print, and a gift. Sometimes a toy. Once, a sock Helen remembered losing ages ago, a pink one that had belonged to Lily with a tiny embroidered butterfly. Once, a single crayon, purple, Lily's favorite color. Each item was like a spark in the dark, lighting up memories long buried beneath grief. Helen started talking aloud during her morning routine, as if speaking to someone just outside the frame. "I know you're out there," she said one morning, placing a fresh dish of food and refilling the water. "I don't know who you are, or how you know her, but thank you." She paused, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You're not just bringing toys. You're bringing her back to me, piece by piece." She began to leave the porch light on overnight, not to scare him away, but so he wouldn't trip in the dark. She added a soft towel beside the mat in case he wanted a place to rest. And every morning, like clockwork, he came. Sometimes he left immediately. Other times the camera showed him sitting for a while after placing the toy down. Just sitting, as if keeping watch, as if waiting. It made Helen's heart ache in a way that didn't feel quite like pain anymore. It was something deeper, something warmer, a connection forming from silence and sorrow. She still didn't know who he was, where he came from, or how he had found Lily's old things. But she was beginning to realize something that made her chest tighten with a mix of fear and awe. He wasn't just delivering items, he was delivering messages. Messages from the past. Messages, perhaps, from Lily herself. And Helen wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Because whoever this dog was, he wasn't a stray anymore. he was family. The sun hadn't fully risen when Helen stepped out that morning. The air was cool and still, with the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. This time, she wasn't waiting by the window. She wasn't watching a screen or checking the porch for another mysterious gift. She was following footprints. For days, she had noticed the subtle trail, muddy paw prints that seemed to vanish just beyond her front yard. Today, they were clearer. Damp grass and soft earth made perfect canvases, each step leading her down the sidewalk like breadcrumbs through the woods. She pulled her coat tighter, her breath visible in the crisp air. Her knees ached, and her pace was slow, but her heart beat with purpose. It had been years since she had wandered beyond the grocery store or the church on Sundays. But this felt important. It felt like something was calling her back. The trail led her past 4 intersections, 2 crumbling fences, and finally to the edge of a street she hadn't walked down in nearly a decade. She froze. The house stood at the end of the block, abandoned, sagging slightly under the weight of time. Paint peeled from the siding like old wallpaper. The front gate hung crooked on one hinge. The windows were boarded up with uneven planks, but Helen didn't need to see inside to know what it was. She had once called this place home. Her fingers brushed over the rusting mailbox, the numbers still faintly painted on the side. 314. She closed her eyes, and suddenly she was younger again, standing on the porch with Lily in her arms, turning the key in the lock for the very first time. The house had been their fresh start after a messy divorce. Small, imperfect, but filled with laughter and memories. They had only lived there for a few years before moving again, closer to Lily's new school, to a better neighborhood. But not everything had come with them. Some boxes had been left behind in the attic, in the crawl space. Helen remembered rushing the move. She had promised herself she'd come back for the rest. But life, as it often does, had moved on. Now it seemed someone or something had returned before her. Helen stepped cautiously through the broken gate, her shoes crunching over dry leaves and broken twigs. The front door was barely latched, and with a gentle push, it creaked open. Dust filled her nose immediately, along with the earthy scent of rot and forgotten time. The air inside was still, heavy, like the house was holding its breath too. She walked slowly through the front room, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through cracks in the boards. The furniture was long gone, the wallpaper peeled like dried petals, but the bones of the place were unmistakable. She recognized the curve of the staircase, the narrow hallway where Lily had once played hide-and-seek. Her feet moved on their own, guided by muscle memory. In what used to be Lily's room, the floorboards creaked as she stepped forward. And there, in the far corner beneath the window, something caught her eye. A small hole. She knelt carefully, brushing away debris. The opening was barely larger than a dinner plate, but inside she saw the glint of plastic. Her hand reached in, pulling out a faded toy, a ring from Lily's stacking set. Then a jigsaw puzzle piece, a crayon, a tiny pink shoe. Tears welled in her eyes. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a hidden trove, a forgotten time capsule buried under dust and silence. The missing pieces of her daughter's childhood, things she hadn't even realized were gone. She looked around the room, the realization sinking in like dawn through mist. The dog had been here. It had found this place, this abandoned shell of their past, and uncovered the remnants of Lily's earliest years. It must have dug through the opening in the floor, one item at a time, and carried them across the neighborhood to her door. But how? Why? Helen stood slowly, wiping her face. She looked around, imagining the dog curled in the corner at night, guarding these fragments like sacred treasures. Had it lived here for years? Was this its home too? And then, the strangest thought crept in. What if it had known Lily? She tried to remember. They had once adopted a stray puppy, briefly, just before moving. Lily had adored it. a scrappy gray thing with big paws and curious eyes, but it had run off one night and never returned. They searched for days, hung posters. Eventually, they gave up. Could it be? She pressed a hand over her heart, trying to steady the wild beat. The timeline fit, the color, the way it moved, the way it brought her only the toys that mattered most. It wasn't proof. Not really. But it didn't need to be. Because somewhere deep inside, in the place where grief and hope quietly coexist, Helen believed. That dog wasn't just a messenger. It wasn't just some mysterious stray. It was a witness to Lily's laughter, to her stories and her songs and her tiny growing world, and now it was doing the only thing it knew how, bringing her back to her mother, one memory at a time. Helen stepped back out into the morning light, arms full of the past, and behind her the old house stood silent but no longer forgotten. Helen had never planned to name him. At first the dog had simply been a mystery, a quiet visitor in the night, a ghost of the past bringing back fragments of Lily's childhood. But now that she had followed his trail, now that she had stood in the ruins of her old home and uncovered the truth, or something close to it, she could no longer pretend he was just a coincidence. He had a name now. She called him Shadow. It felt right. He moved like one, silent, watchful, present, without ever asking to be seen. And like a shadow, he had always been there, waiting on the edge of her memories. The first morning she said it aloud, he paused. He had just dropped a faded coloring book on her porch. One Helen distinctly remembered Lily scribbling in during a road trip when she was 7. The pages were torn, but the cover still held traces of bright purple crayon. Shadow had placed it down gently, as always, then turned to leave. "Wait," she whispered, stepping out onto the porch barefoot. "Shadow." The dog stopped. He didn't turn around right away. He stood there, as if trying to decide whether to trust the sound of her voice. Slowly, he looked over his shoulder. Their eyes met. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't run to her or wag his tail wildly, but he stayed. That was enough. That afternoon, Helen did something she hadn't done in years. She loaded up her old car and took a drive. Shadow sat beside her in the passenger seat, his body heavy with the kind of calm that only came from exhaustion or old pain. His eyes scanned the trees outside the window, but he never barked or stirred. She brought him to the local veterinary clinic, a modest building tucked between a bakery and a bookstore. The staff greeted her kindly, if a little surprised to see her with a dog. Inside the examination room, the vet, a gentle woman named Dr. Avery, knelt in front of Shadow with practiced care. "He's been through a lot," she murmured, brushing a hand down his back. "You can see it in the way he holds himself." Helen nodded silently, her eyes fixed on the old scar near his back leg. Dr. Avery ran a scanner over his neck, checking for a microchip. Nothing. "No ID," she confirmed. "No collar, no registration." Helen had expected that. "He's underweight," the doctor continued, examining his paws, "but otherwise stable. This scar here," she pointed to the healed wound on his leg, "looks like it's from an old break. Likely healed on its own. He's adapted to the limp. Might have been hit by a car or something years ago." Helen looked away. Dr. Avery turned her attention to Shadow's behavior. She gently offered him a treat, which he took without hesitation, and then issued a simple command. "Sit." To Helen's surprise, Shadow obeyed immediately. She tried a few more. "Stay." "Down." "Come." Each time he responded, not quickly, but correctly. Not with eagerness, but with calm, deliberate motion. "This dog's been trained," the vet said finally, standing, "and not just basic obedience. This is the kind of responsiveness you see in therapy dogs, maybe even search and rescue." Helen's breath caught. "He's gentle," Dr. Avery added as Shadow leaned into her palm. The way he watches you? He's bonded. Deeply. On the drive home, Helen kept glancing sideways at him. It was as though a new door had opened in her mind, one she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through. Shadow wasn't just any dog. He had lived with people before, possibly with children, maybe even with Lily. She tried to recall that old memory, the stray puppy Lily had adored, the one who had vanished so suddenly all those years ago. Could this be the same dog, grown older, hardened by life, and now returned? The logical part of her mind pushed back. The odds were too slim, the years too many. But the rest of her, the aching part, the part that had lived with an empty chair and a dust-covered room for 3 long years, refused to dismiss the thought. Because there was something in Shadow's eyes. Something in the way he lay near Lily's toys. In the way he lingered by the bedroom door without ever going in. As if he knew it was sacred. Helen watched him sleep on the porch that evening. His body curled tight, but his face relaxed. He trusted her now. Or maybe he had always trusted her. He had just been waiting for her to remember. She whispered to the wind, not even sure who she was speaking to. Maybe to Lily. Maybe to something beyond. "Did you send him to me?" The breeze rustled the leaves overhead, soft as breath. She didn't need an answer. She already knew. Some bonds are too strong to break. Some threads, too invisible to see, but impossible to sever. And somehow, across years of silence, Shadow had followed the one that still connected her to her daughter. Not just a dog, a messenger, a guardian, a shadow of love that never left. The rain started just after midnight. Helen had always found storms oddly comforting, the rhythm of raindrops against the roof, the way thunder rolled in the distance like the world breathing. But that night, something felt different. The wind howled louder. The branches outside scratched against the windows like restless fingers. And more than anything, the porch was silent. Shadow didn't come. By 2 a.m., Helen was pacing by the front door, peering through the glass into the sheets of rain. The bowl of food she had left out remained untouched. The towel she had carefully folded in the corner of the porch was soaked, unmoved. He always came back, every night, without fail. Her heart clenched with a kind of dread she hadn't felt since Lily was a child. The kind that gnawed at her chest during those rare, terrifying moments when Lily had wandered off too far at the park or missed the bus home. That deep, primal panic that only comes when someone you love has gone missing. By 3 a.m., Helen couldn't take it anymore. She pulled on her coat, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped into the storm. The wind tore at her hood as she called his name into the night. "Shadow! Come here, boy!" Her voice was nearly lost in the wind, but she didn't stop. She trudged through puddles, her shoes soaked, her breath ragged, street by street, yard by yard. The storm battered her relentlessly, but her fear was stronger than the cold. She searched every alley, every corner, her flashlight cutting through the dark like a desperate question. "Where are you?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Nothing answered but the rain. By sunrise, Helen was soaked to the bone and trembling, her joints screaming with every step. She returned home empty-handed, exhausted, but unable to rest. She sat on the porch, her blanket wrapped tight, staring at the street as if willing him to appear. Then, just as the sky turned from black to gray, a figure emerged from the fog. Shadow. He limped toward her slowly, drenched from head to tail, his coat darkened by the rain, his legs caked in mud. His body trembled, and he looked thinner than usual, like the storm had taken more than just warmth from him. But what made Helen rise to her feet with a gasp wasn't the state he was in. It was what he carried in his mouth. A photograph. Carefully clenched between his teeth, protected from the worst of the rain, was a small, faded photo. Shadow stopped at the edge of the porch and looked up at her with eyes full of something she couldn't name. Weariness, perhaps. Or peace. Helen dropped to her knees and reached out gently. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're home." He stepped forward, placed the photo on the doormat, and collapsed beside her with a heavy sigh, resting his head against her thigh. She stroked his soaked fur with trembling hands, but her eyes were locked on the photograph. It was wrinkled, water-stained, but not destroyed. 3 figures stood in the center of the image. Helen herself, younger, her hair darker, her arms wrapped protectively around a little girl in a sun hat. Lily, and nestled in Lily's lap was a puppy. Gray fur, bright eyes, the ears slightly too big for its head. Helen's breath caught. She remembered this day. It was taken in their old backyard. Lily had just turned 5, and they had found a small stray puppy a few days before. Lily had fallen in love with him instantly. She'd named him Benny, and for 2 blissful months they had been inseparable, playing dress-up, sharing snacks, curling up together for naps. Helen had even started getting used to the idea of keeping him. Then, during a chaotic move across town, the puppy had slipped out of the yard and disappeared. They searched for days. Posters, flyers, phone calls. Lily cried herself to sleep every night for a week. And then, like most lost things, time slowly covered the memory with dust. But Shadow had remembered. Or maybe he had never forgotten. Tears streamed down Helen's face as she gently traced her finger along the photo. "It's you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're him. You're Benny." Shadow didn't move, but his eyes flicked up to meet hers, soft and knowing. It all made sense now. The familiarity, the silent loyalty, the way he lingered by Lily's things like they belonged to him too. He had spent all those years trying to find his way back, through time, through storm, through pain. And he had brought her one final gift. Not just a memory, not just a relic. Proof. He had been there. He had loved her. And somehow, across years and miles, he had returned to keep loving the one person Lily had left behind. Helen wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face into his wet fur. "Thank you," she sobbed. "For everything. For coming home." Shadow didn't respond with a bark or a wag. He simply leaned into her, resting there in the morning light, as the last drops of rain fell quietly around them. 2 souls, reunited by a bond that had never truly broken. The day the rain stopped, Helen made her decision. Shadow lay curled at her feet on the living room rug, still recovering from his stormy journey, his breathing deep and slow. The photograph, now dried and pressed between the pages of an old book, rested on the table beside them. It had become something sacred, proof of a truth that no longer needed explaining. Shadow was family. He always had been. Helen stood slowly, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled out a small box she hadn't opened in years. Inside were items she had tucked away after Lily's passing, too painful to look at, too precious to throw away. From it, she retrieved an old leather collar, cracked and faded, far too small now for a full-grown dog. She smiled gently and placed it beside the photograph. Then she reached for her keys. At the local pet store, the clerk greeted her with a warm, slightly surprised smile. Helen hadn't been in for years. She explained that she was adopting a dog, an older Pitbull, no chip, no history, but with eyes that carried whole lifetimes. "What name would you like engraved on the tag?" the clerk asked. Helen didn't hesitate. "Shadow," she said softly. "Always with Lily." Back home, she fastened the new collar around his neck, the tag clinking softly as it settled in place. Shadow raised his head, looking at her with quiet trust. She ran her hand along his back and smiled. "You're home now," she whispered. "For good." That afternoon, Helen opened the door that had stayed closed for far too long. Lily's room was exactly as she had left it, but now it no longer felt like a shrine to sorrow. It felt like an unfinished story, waiting to be read again. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, dust motes dancing in the beams like tiny ghosts of laughter. Helen stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. She took her time, moving gently through the space. She fluffed the pillows on the bed, carefully dusted the shelves, and opened the window to let in fresh air. On the dresser, she arranged some of the toys Shadow had brought back. Mr. Snuggles, the teacup, the faded coloring book. Each item had found its way home, just like the dog who carried them. At the foot of the bed, she placed a small dog bed lined with Lily's old blanket, the one with stars and moons stitched along the edges. Shadow settled there immediately, his head resting on his paws, eyes soft with something close to peace. From that day forward, the room transformed into something new. Not a museum of grief, but a living tribute. Helen filled it with flowers and photos, with soft lights and handwritten notes Lily had once scrawled in crooked letters. She and Shadow would sit there in the evenings, the radio humming quietly in the background, sometimes reading old books aloud, other times simply resting in the silence together. And the silence no longer hurt. Mornings began differently now. Helen woke not to emptiness, but to the soft jingle of Shadow's collar and the warm thud of his tail against the floor. She would stretch, rise, and head to the kitchen, where 2 bowls waited, one for tea, one for kibble. Sometimes, when the sun poured golden through the windows, she would find herself humming. Just a little tune, nothing fancy, but it was the kind of sound that hadn't lived in the house for a long time. She started walking again, not just down the driveway but through the neighborhood, Shadow trotting beside her, his limp barely noticeable. Neighbors waved, children smiled and pointed. "What a good dog," they'd say, and Helen would smile too. She hadn't opened it in over a decade. But tonight, she turned to a fresh page. She wrote slowly, carefully, the words coming not from sorrow, but from something deeper, something rooted in healing, in understanding. Lily's love never left me. It just chose a different shape to come home in. She paused, blinking back tears. Outside the window, the wind rustled gently through the trees. Shadow lifted his head from the blanket, watching her. Helen looked at him and smiled. "Thank you," she said softly, "for finding me." That night, she left the door to Lily's room open. Shadow climbed into his bed, circled twice, and lay down with a contented sigh. Helen turned off the light, not with sadness, but with peace. Because in a world full of loss and unanswered questions, something had come full circle. A bond broken by time had mended itself not with words, but with quiet loyalty, with old toys, with muddy paw prints, and a photo carried through the storm. And now, each new day no longer began with aching emptiness. It began with gratitude, for love, true, quiet, patient love, always finds its way back home. If you made it this far, thank you, truly. Because stories like this aren't just meant to be watched, they're meant to be felt. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was the return of a forgotten promise, the living heartbeat of a love that never truly left. Helen's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest gifts are the ones we never expect, found not in grand gestures, but in quiet loyalty, muddy paw prints, and memories that come home. As the saying goes, what is loved is never lost, and what is truly meant for us will always find its way. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment, subscribe to Vale Marks, and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support is the light that guides these stories into the world. It's what inspires me to create more heartfelt, meaningful content just for you. Because love never leaves, and neither do the stories it writes.